Hi, I'm Ann Coulter. Welcome to my Substack. I'm here with my new favorite author, David Zweig, author of Abundance of Caution, which is a total compendium of the media, the intelligentsia, the scientific community, influencers lying about COVID and shutting the schools down, ruining many, many people's lives. There is so much to talk to you about this book. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me.
I looked up right before you signed on. I did not know you were, in addition to before this magnificent book, freelance writer. You'd written novels and you were a musician.
Back in the day, indeed.
Well, I'm glad you got done with that and did this book, because the book it's really something. I mean, the notes I've taken on it. I'm never going to get to every part of this. I think my notes are about half as long as your book now. It's so great. There is nothing. It is impenetrable. And there were a few things. I mean, I followed this pretty closely at the time. And there were many things that I didn't know that are very interesting. We'll get to the details of how you, and I might add, I was right about not needing, that it was basically if you were 80 or over, you were in danger and no one else was, which, oh my gosh, you have the goods on that. But I wanted to start with the political aspect of this, which I've noticed this myself. I mean, it was basically the theme of my last book, Resistance is Futile. Trump just broke liberal minds, and he could come out against pedophilia, and they would have to be for pedophilia. You can get liberals to do anything by having Trump say the opposite. So on page 185, this is going to the longest quote, maybe the only quote I'll read from your book, but it is, I think, so important. The notion of opening schools was now seen as explicitly part of Trump's Open Everything Up campaign, and in the process became radioactive to many liberals. This was a demonstrably obvious fact of the political and social reality of the Trump presidency, which was hated and feared with such breadth and intensity that the day after his inauguration, it spawned what was reported to be the largest single-day protest in American history. Did not know that. The left and much of the cosmopolitan elite in America saw Trump as so clownish, ignorant, malignant, and harmful to society that, with rare exception, it was anathema for a Democrat politician or official, a journalist or news organization, other than conservative outlets, to ever be seen as agreeing with him on anything. This dynamic was no less ingrained in much of the professional and influencer classes in publishing, technology, and so on. That is a theme running throughout this book when you have overwhelming evidence. And oh my gosh, now we know once again how much the Pulitzer is worth. The stuff you have on the New York Times. Well, describe what you have on the New York Times.
Yeah, I have what I would call like a series of case studies, really, of these lengthy, very important New York Times articles. In many regards, we can view the New York Times as just one outlet, of course, but what happens there often influences many other media outlets. They're sort of the tip of the spear, so to speak. I also had parents around the country contact me after certain New York Times articles came out, and they said, my school board told me they're not opening schools because of this New York Times article. So make no mistake, this isn't just conjecture that I'm saying, oh, these articles were influential. It's a fact that many of these articles actually prevented kids from going to school. And what I show is I sort of dissect some of these really influential, important features that the Times had run during the pandemic, particularly in the first 6 months and first year of the pandemic, where they were just, I wouldn't say they were riddled with errors, because you could fact check them and find that everything in there was, quote, correct, but rather they were framed in such a way as to give a mistaken impression about a reality.
Yes, you remind me. This is how the New York Times lies. They lie by omission. My version of this is, so every sentence is, yes, that's technically true, but you're giving the wrong impression. So my example of this is a Hitler obituary. Painter dies. War veteran and painter dies. What? Did we get anything wrong? No, that's technically true, but you left out some important stuff. And the stuff they were leaving out of the COVID articles, well, we'll get to, by the way, McNeil, I thought it might just be that one woman who was the one who was covering it. And they're as this book documents through and through, oh my gosh, was the New York Times wrong about COVID? And they won a Pulitzer Prize for their COVID reporting.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable.
So describe how it is that they lied through omission, painter dies.
Right. And a sort of metaphor I might think of is when a photograph, you choose what's going to be within the frame and what gets cropped out, and you choose the lighting and such. And it's the same thing with news articles, as you know. And over and over, the Times had what I would describe almost as a fixation with drumming up fear, and in particular, fear around children and schools. It was almost like, maybe fetish is too strong of a word, but it was a bizarre thing to see. And we saw this in much of the legacy media, but the Times in particular, and they had a couple reporters who were on this beat. And this was the lens through which they viewed the entire pandemic. And because of that particular lens, it had a dramatic distorting effect on how the American public, or at least the American public who read the Times, who then influence, other people within the sort of intelligentsia and the influencer classes. These are the people who are getting their information from there. That ultimately had an effect both on the public conversation and on policy within our country. And what was often left out was an enormous amount of just manifest empirical evidence, oftentimes from Europe, that was either absent or, when it was mentioned, was metaphorically waved away with the hand with some very specious sort of one-off statement. Oh, well, they controlled the virus or something like that, which was kind of unprovable, non-scientific statement. So over and over, we had instances of this type of reporting, and often where there was, what's known as argument from authority, where it was not that something was correct, but merely that the credential of the person saying it, that's enough. We don't need any evidence. It's just so-and-so is saying this. Moreover, oftentimes they didn't attribute the quote to anyone in particular. It was just experts say. The consensus is that schools need to be closed until you get HEPA filters or whatever it is. This was made up. This was not true.
Could you describe the article about the 23 epidemiologists and when they'll send their kids back to school?
So this is like the argument from authority, except the way I describe it, Ann, is that it's like two steps removed from that. So first of all, it's bad. It's a fallacy to have an argument from authority where you say it's sort of like a mom. It's because I said so. That's why, because I'm the mom. That's essentially what they're saying. But this was even worse because the people that they included in this article about epidemiologists weren't even experts in infectious diseases, half of them. They didn't tell you that in the article. It just said epidemiologists give their advice on when kids should go back to school. But I started looking up the individuals in the article. There was a PhD student in there who was studying, like oncology. There was someone else who was looking at, heavy metals in food or whatever it may be. Just this, someone else was working.
I liked the one who was an advisor to smokeless tobacco.
Smokeless tobacco. Right. So and a number of them didn't have children. So we're supposed to be taking advice from these people on how to conduct ourselves as a society based on their expertise, yet they didn't even have the expertise that was purported in the title of the New York Times article. They left that part out of the piece.
Yes. You also have a fantastic section on, maybe you know it from memory, I'll find it for you if you don't, but epidemiologists and their politics.
Yeah, much of the public health establishment it has a sort of uniformity politically, and they tend to be on the left. And
that surprised me.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, there is a sort of connection between, at least in my mind, you might disagree, but the idea that if you go into public health, you have a belief, and this comes from a noble place, you want to help people, but it comes from a belief that large-scale kind of top-down interventions are effective. And that kind of ties into a leftist view about government and how society should function. Some of these interventions are effective, and that's wonderful. Many of them are not. And one of the things that I find so fascinating, and I cite some studies of this in the book, I'm not sure if you got to this part, is that people in public health repeatedly overestimate the impact or the benefit of the interventions that they want to impose. That time and again, they think some intervention, they're gonna help low-income mothers because they're uneducated. We're gonna help them and send a nurse to their home every week to help educate them, in a perinatal environment. It turns out millions and millions of dollars were spent on this study that I cite in the book, and there was no benefit at all. But it seemed like it would make sense. Oh, they lack education. If we give them someone to help educate them, they're gonna have better outcomes because we know poor education equates with poor outcomes. Wrong, it didn't work. And there's like a zillion examples of things where they might make intuitive sense, but they don't actually work in real life. And that's a big theme of my book, is this kind of like divergence between the theoretical and the empirical and the reality. And over, we were kind of beaten over the head with this idea of like, well, of course this works. It's basic physics. How dare you, question this? But that's not how medicine works. That's not how science or public health works. And I try to show in the book over and over how our intuitions are often wrong. And that certainly was the case within the pandemic. But we weren't allowed to question this.
You can watch complete episodes of Unsafe with Ann Coulter by subscribing to anncoulter.substack.com. That's anncoulter.substack.com. You can also listen to complete episodes for free at Ricochet.com. Choose Unsafe from the pull-down menu at the top of the page. That's Ricochet.com, your home for civil center right conversation on the web.